I'm watching her.
Okay, I think we'll get started. Thank you everyone for coming. This is a talk that's co-sponsored by MISC and Social Media Research Lab, and I'm super excited to announce both of our speakers today. So Jessica Vitak, I had the honor of serving as her advisor at MSU in her doctoral program there. And she is now an assistant professor in the College of Information Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park campus, and associate director of the Human-Computer Interaction Lab. She has a wide range of work that she does, much of which looks broadly at social implications of social media use. Her work most recently has looked at some of the privacy and ethical dimensions of kind of big data, which of course this week in particular is especially very timely. She has several grants, the most recent one that's looking at broadly at research and data ethics. So without further ado, Jessica Vitak.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. So today I'm not talking about Cambridge Analytica, although I think that would be a great talk. But I did come up with this topic about a month ago, and it is a very appropriate topic given the events of the last week or so. So I'm going to be talking about some of my research, focusing mainly on one grant, hinting at some of the stuff with another grant. So as Nicole said, I'm at the iSchool at College Park. The research I'm going to talk about today is with this group of people. This is in Milwaukee. That's the Fonz, because when you're in Milwaukee, what do? You take a picture with the Fonz. So this is going to be, this is research with UW Milwaukee and folks at Erasmus University. We got NSF funding in partnership with funding from the Dutch National Funding Agency to look at mobile privacy and surveillance issues. And so that's the grant on the left. So that's one of them. The other one that I'm going to hint at today is the one Nicole mentioned. We got an NSF large last year. Myself and Katie Shilton at the University of Maryland and 6 other institutions are part of this very big project. So broadly, the goal is looking at data ethics from a variety of stakeholder positions, and I'm happy to comment or answer questions about that research, which just got up and running in the last 6 months. So kind of the main starting point that I want to talk about in this talk is this idea that we no longer seem to have much control over sharing data. And whether or not we are willingly posting things to Facebook, Twitter, wherever, or we are trying to restrict access, we are still contributing lots of information about ourselves every day through internet searches, through the things we share, through the things that people we're connected to share about us. So we don't have a ton of control over this data that we're sharing, and it's creating these massive, basically, repositories that are then sold to advertisers who then use that to target us. One area in which we can look at this is through this idea of the quantified self. And the quantified self movement arose a long time ago, and as a way of kind of quantifying metrics about yourself and learning about yourself as an individual. So long before Fitbits, we had people who were doing life logging activities. And there are many examples of that. But this idea of how do you gain self-knowledge by tracking yourself? It's a very powerful tool. We have technologies like Apple Watch, like Fitbit, that have simplified the process by collecting massive amounts of data about us. But it's this idea about learning more about yourself and your body. And we see multiple ways in which this manifests now, whether it is a fitness tracker, whether it's a posture tracker that tells you when you're slouching too much, or something that you put on your shoe. There's a whole industry for this type of, these types of devices. The important thing to know here is that we tend to focus on the steps as the main metric that's collected, but there's a ton of other data that these devices might be collecting about you. And this could include things from the distance that you're walking to the number of flights you are, to some are tracking your location, some are tracking your heart rate, some are tracking your sleep, and we'll start to see why this is important as we go along. So the most important thing, I think, to the success of these is that these objects are meant to be worn and kind of blend into the background, so that you're not thinking about the fact that as I'm wearing this device and moving around through the day, it is constantly logging information about me. So, now we have these devices that are being designed to almost look like jewelry. So, they look less and less like fitness devices and more like jewelry, but the goal in the end is the same. They're tracking and collecting data about you. The other area that we're moving into in this grant, and I just want to touch on this because this is something we've just started to collect data about, is devices that are always passively listening. And the reason I think these devices like Alexa, Google Home, now the Apple HomePod, are especially interesting cases is because they're meant to be in the home. And your home is considered, the place where you have privacy. Even if you don't have privacy anywhere else, you know that when you go home, that is a space where it is a private space. And yet we are installing devices that we plug in and connect to the internet and then are always listening for us to say, hey Alexa. And it's unclear still to what extent they are recording, sending off data, storing data, how long they're storing data, outside of the specific request you're asking. So if you're saying play this song, okay, they're going to take that. But they're collecting a lot of other data potentially. And are they just deleting it or not? So privacy in the home is becoming questionable. My favorite current XKCD comic is this idea that you go in somebody's house, you want to know, do they have an Alexa? So you just, shout out the names. Like, hey Alexa, hey Google Home, whatever you might call it. Just to see if it's in the house and listening. So, how did we get to this point, and how are we at this point in which we have very tiny devices that are collecting tons of data constantly? This idea that the sensors themselves, the technology itself that is running these devices is getting much better and much smaller, much like computing power in general. The growth of smartphones is a tremendous factor here, obviously. If we didn't have the computing power of the smartphones that we have today, this wouldn't be around. This idea of public sharing becoming normalized is a factor that I think often gets overlooked or underplayed. This idea that 15 years ago, we would take issue with sharing a lot of the content that we regularly just put into Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or wherever and click send. The idea that very slowly in the Facebook age, we've become okay with sharing very sensitive details about ourselves, and I think that trickles out into making it okay for us to share data in other spaces. And then obviously the rise of the cloud and more broadly the Internet of Things. So, this raises questions about what happens with the data. And what we were interested in is, what do the people who buy these types of devices, who buy the Google Home, are they actually thinking about privacy issues and security issues? Are they thinking about that data? Or is it just the idea of the convenience of, oh, I get to know how many steps I'm taking. Oh, I get to know the reason why I feel so crappy when I wake up is because I was tossing and turning all night. And the Fitbit can tell me that. So wanting to know how people are understanding these decisions when they're buying these types of devices. Another big thing that is kind of becoming increasingly concerning, and another motivating factor for us doing this research, is this idea of what can you infer from this kind of data. And so, some of these in the top, the idea of making inferences about a person's dietary habits or stress levels makes some sense. The important thing here is that we're assuming this is good quality data, and that's sketchy in and of itself. But when we get to the bottom here, and these questions about, can we make inferences about what a person's insurance rates should be for their health insurance? Should people's rates go up or down based on just the number of steps that they take? Is that, there are many ethical implications of that. Even more ridiculous, you might think, but certainly possible, is can we make inferences about a person's fidelity? And I was talking about this at lunch, the idea if you have a spike in your heart rate and no steps, you can make an argument for what that means if you're trying to catch a cheating spouse, especially if it's at like at 3 a.m. in the morning. So, inferences from potentially flawed data is problematic, but we're seeing that the court systems are starting to go to this data as if it is perfect data, as if it is accurate, and it does reflect people. So we're seeing more incidents in which lawyers are turning to Fitbit data to defend or to make arguments against defendants. And this is concerning for the reasons I just stated. This data is not perfect data. It can be gamed. The data itself can be flawed. So even though there are these potential issues with the data, the kind of takeaway here is the people who use these devices basically don't see this data as very meaningful, valuable, sensitive, and we see that as problematic. So when we talk about sensitive data, and we have a paper that's being presented at the I-Conference with this work next week, in which we talk about personal fitness data, PFI. And this idea of PII and how people think about PII in relationship to other types of sensitive data. And the thing is we have much data that we're posting about ourselves that is potentially sensitive. So we wanted to, in this study, we wanted to look at what people's knowledge was of the data practices of these companies. Do they think that this data is actually sensitive or valuable to others? And are there factors that influence whether or not they feel this way? So we did a survey of Fitbit and Jawbone users. Really 95% of them were Fitbit users, so I tend to just say Fitbit because Jawbone is really not that popular. And we did interviews with a subset of those users. And I'm just going to summarize findings because I don't have a lot of time. Just kind of the high-level findings here are, first, unsurprisingly, shockingly enough, people don't really read privacy policies. That is not new information. We have lots of data from privacy policies more generally. But, are fitness trackers different? Absolutely not. So they're not reading them. They're not aware of what the policies are for what happens to the data once it gets transmitted from the device to the company. And they're not concerned about it. Because again, they're thinking about things like steps, which they see as non-risky. They're not thinking about steps plus heart rate plus sleep, then going to another company that has other data about you and aggregate it together. They're literally breaking down and just focusing on kind of like the barest minimum of the data that's being collected, and that would be probably steps. The other thing that we found is that the extent to which people had or didn't have knowledge about these companies' privacy policies, and some people did have some knowledge, was completely unrelated to whether or not they had concerns. And so in the paper we do structural equation modeling to try to predict the sensitivity, so how sensitive they think this data is. And the knowledge variable just completely fell out of the model. It just the model would not fit. The data would not fit the model if you had that knowledge variable in there. And so what that meant was, it didn't matter if you had high knowledge or low knowledge. It didn't matter if you had a really strong understanding that Fitbit was sharing that data with other companies. That didn't affect whether or not you were concerned. And again, it goes back to this idea that people see this data as not having much value. Another big thing that's very closely related to this is this idea that the benefits of using a device like this far outweigh any perceived risks. So the idea that I'm wearing a device that's going to help me get more fit in theory, even though there isn't really much research that shows that Fitbits actually make people more fit or make them lose weight. So I'm going to wear this device. I like having something that shows me my steps. And that is more important than the fact that I'm generating all this data over time about myself, and I don't know what might be done with it down the line. And then from a design perspective, and I do HCI research, and this was a big one, is this idea that people almost completely interacted with these devices through a mobile app. They didn't go to the web interface, unless they had to. And you can set up your account once you download the app, on the app. There's never a reason for you to do it. But the problem with that is that the app has very basic privacy settings. You need to go to the web interface in order to get any level of granularity of privacy. So this is the privacy settings page for Fitbit if you go to the web dashboard. And you can see that you can change each type of data that's generated and decide, okay, do I want to keep it just to me? Do I want to share it with my friends? Do I want to make it public? If you log on through the app, this is all you get. It is just everything becomes public, friends, or private. And the problem there is if you are motivated for your friends, for example, to see your steps, maybe so you can engage in some of the competition aspects, well then everything else has to become visible to them. And so your sleep data, your heart rate data, whatever it is, then becomes visible to at least the people you're connected with. Likewise, if you wanted it to be more widely available, everything has to go with it. And so this is a huge design issue. And when we were doing the interviews with people, we actually, at the end of the interview, were like, okay, well, let's log in to your account and let's see if you can, find your way to the privacy settings, do it on your phone, do it on the web. And so many people were like, I don't recognize this interface. I don't know if I've ever been on the website. They just had no idea. And on both interfaces, it's hard to find, which is a shame. So what are the implications of this? Two that I want to mention briefly. One is this idea of privacy by design, which if you don't do any privacy work, you might not be very familiar with. Privacy by design is this idea that rather than when you're designing a new product, so you're going to build the next Facebook killer, the next big app that's going to take over, rather than just saying, okay, let's build this app for social interaction, okay, we have everything all set, oh yeah, and let's just drop on this one feature at the end and let them, make their post private or public. Rather than kind of taking this approach that privacy is something to be thought of at the end of the process, integrating privacy from the very beginning of the design process and making it part of the discussion in each step of the design phase so that it's influencing all of your design decisions. That's kind of privacy by design in a nutshell. The other idea here is this idea of how do we nudge people to engage in more privacy-enhancing behaviors, and this is potentially controversial. People don't want to be nudged, but Facebook has actually employed this really successfully. If you've ever gotten a pop-up note that's like, before when you go to post something, it's like, oh, we noticed your post is set to public. Are you sure you want to share it to public? Or, your last post went to this group of people. Is this what you want your next one to? And nudging is the idea, people don't want to be shoved. They don't want to be told what to do. They want to have some agency. But if you remind them, for example, maybe by every couple months popping up, your current privacy settings are set to share things with your friends. Is this still what you want to do? Is an easy way to remind users of this, something that they are going to quickly forget about, and try to get them to then kind of re-engage cognitively with and make those decisions on a regular basis, rather than a set it and forget it type mentality. But obviously there are lots of ethical issues with this, both from the company's perspective and whether or not they can be more transparent in their data sharing practices, on the researcher end about collecting this type of data and what you do with it. Obviously, Cambridge Analytica is a great example of collecting data under one set of pretenses and then potentially using it in other ways. So these are all questions that I'm struggling with that I think will keep me busy for the next 20 years, because I don't think there's easy answers to them. And I'm just about out of time, so I will wrap it up so Yvette can talk. And thank you.
Thanks, Vitak. So I think Yvette's going to get set up here. So happy to introduce Yvette Wohn, who also worked with both Cliff and myself at Michigan State University. And she and I did a bunch of work funded by the Gaines Foundation to look at whether social media can help low-income students and first-generation students access social support and information. She's now an assistant professor of informatics at the New Jersey Institute of Technology and directs the Social Interaction Lab, which is funded by NSF, Mozilla, and Yahoo, among others. She has, in addition to being an accomplished artist and just an all-around wonderful person and one of my favorite students ever,
I told her to say that.
She also has a wide-ranging and fascinating set of topics that she explores, and today is going to focus, I think, on a more recent work looking at bots and whether they are able to provide social support. So, thank you.
Thank you. Wow, that was like the best introduction ever. Hi, I'm Yvette, and today I want to talk a little bit about my work on social support in social media. And this is something that's very dear to my heart. I always thought that the internet was a very lonely place, and when I was a PhD student, one of my first topics was how do we make online a less lonely place? And that's how I got to work with Nicole, and we studied things about like social capital and all the benefits of social media, et cetera, et cetera. So here, I use social provision as a research lens. And so when I talk about social provision, I'm talking about emotional support, instrumental, informational, and even money, like monetary support. And looking at this from a socio-technical perspective. So what are the human factors that contribute to social provision, as well as what are the design or algorithms that, that contribute to how people provide these different types of social support through social media. Just a little, I know you can't see this, but I just want to say that for me, the platform doesn't matter as much. So I've been looking at kind of similar topics across different types of platforms. For example, looking at receiving a like. Does getting a like on Facebook make you feel more supported? And yes, we've done research that shows that actually it does. But also looking at it in different social media contexts. For example, competitive gaming is a situation where people have to engage in a lot of communication through a mediated environment, very intense competitive situation. How does social support arise in those kind of situations? Have some qualitative work looking at that. And then more recently looking at social support in the context of live streaming. And next month at CHI, I will be presenting something on what predicts whether or not someone's willing to give emotional, informational, and financial support to someone. So when people are looking at live streams, sometimes they donate money to the person who's streaming. So what predicts that? And of course, it's a number of different factors that's related to relationships, as well as design, as well as individual attributes of the person who's willing to give the money. Finally, also kind of looking at the role of kind of more haptic and tangible things. So when you're interacting with a chatbot, for example, if you're touching something warm, does it make you feel closer to the chatbot? So these are kind of research that generally fall under the kind of umbrella of what I consider social provision, thinking about how the design of the technology can help assist in that social provision process. So a lot of my kind of earlier work focused on studying how this happens in systems that already exist. But as an assistant professor, I thought, well, what if I were building my own system? Like, what would I have to do to make a socially supportive environment? And we know that social environments provide social support, but when you're trying to build something from the ground up, like what kind of things do you need to consider? And so I've been working on, more from a development perspective, 3 different applications that are designed specifically for a social support focus. One was looking at high school students transitioning to college, and kind of extending the work that I did with Nicole. Like, we know that retention is a huge issue in college, that most of the people who drop out in their first year. And one of the biggest reasons for that is that they, of course, the academic issues, but also the social issues where they cannot really integrate into the fabric of kind of the university life. And so how do we make that transition easier for them? The second one is opioid dependence and their network. Opioid addiction is like a huge issue in the US right now, and it's getting worse. And of course, there's a chemical component to it, but there's also a social component where a lot of the people who become addicts don't really have the necessary social support structure that is needed to kind of overcome and integrate back into society. And finally, women in STEM, we all know that there's been lots of reports, more and more coming out about how it's very difficult to be a woman, not just in science, but in science, male-dominated fields. And what if we were designing a system for those people to provide support to each other? So in building these kind of applications, this is where I thought about, okay, how do you design an environment that facilitates these social interactions? So then it kind of gets back to what are some fundamental problems about social media? And there are a lot of them, but today I want to talk about two things primarily. The first one is attention. Social media is currently designed to grab your attention, and a lot of psychologists kind of explain this as kind of like a conditioning that happens, that is very similar to the process that you see in substance addiction, where these random notifications and this constant uploading of new content, it creates these kind of instant gratifications that you can get addicted to over a period of time. So of course this is great from the company's perspective because like people are constantly engaged, but from the user's perspective, that could also have some negative kind of implications where you might feel like you're becoming a slave to the system. So of course, if we were designing a social support system, we would want people to use it, right? But would we want them to get addicted to a social support system? Like that's not what we want, so that's something that we have to think about. The other thing is that a lot of the algorithms are designed so that it's a rich get richer environment where if you are getting a lot of attention, you get more attention. And I'm sure you notice this a lot if you're using Facebook or Twitter, where posts that get a lot of feedback, such as in the form of likes or reactions or comments, they usually rise to the top of what you see. And this is not just in kind of your news feed, but you also see it, for example, on news posts as well. If you look at news articles that are posted, news links that are posted on social media, for example, they have like top comments. So the top comment algorithm is fueled by how much social feedback that comment received. So a lot of the ways that the algorithms are designed are based on which content got more feedback, which is great because maybe, the content that gets more feedback, maybe it's more higher quality or more interesting, et cetera, et cetera. So it is a good kind of crowdsourcing way of trying to get at better content. But at the same time, it means that people who don't get attention just don't get attention. And when you're trying to design a social support system, you want, people there actually need the attention. So how do you redistribute attention to people who are not getting attention? The second problem are people are nice and a lot of positive things happen, but there's also a lot of meanness going on. Online harassment, trolling, bullying. These are fundamental problems that one may argue, or I would like to argue, is something that you need to think about when you're designing the system from the beginning instead of trying to retrospectively deal with something like that. So I'm going to talk about two projects where kind of I look at these different issues, and of course there's no solution, and if I did have that, I think I would probably be making a lot of money. But looking at these kind of questions and trying to see how these different design elements contribute to perhaps alleviating some of these existing problems. So the first project I want to talk about is this app that I've developed that was, I spoke about a little bit earlier, that helps high school students transition into college. it's called Njit Buddies because I work at NJIT, and it's a hyper-local social app, so you just need your NJIT email to actually sign up. It's kind of like, I guess, kind of like Yik Yak meets Twitter meets online forum kind of thing, where you have this news feed. You can like, it's like a forum where you can post things. There's like different categories in which to post, and it's so in terms of the basic interactions that you can have in the app, there's really nothing novel about it. You know, you post things, people ask questions, you can get questions answered, etc. But we paid attention to very, very small things in the design that we found through kind of user testing and field studies actually made a difference. So one of the things was to build supportive interactions into the design itself. So one of the things that you will probably know if you've used any social media is that you can see which posts get more attention. Like, oh, it looks like Libby received 10 likes on her post, but I only received 2. That might make you feel bad, right? So one thing that we did is to discourage any kind of competition, we hid the feedback metrics. So you can see how much feedback you got, but you can't see how much feedback other people got. And we found that especially, for normal people it didn't matter as much, but for people who had like a very low well-being or did not have a lot of self-confidence, like that was like very important for them. And then another design thing that we had to facilitate supportive interactions was this feedback metric. So instead of a like, we had a hug. And you might think, oh, well, like, hug, it's kind of like the same thing. But the semantic kind of, and the connotations around kind of a hug as being something supportive actually made people feel supported. And this was something that we were kind of not sure it would work out, so we tried, but people were saying that like, when they posted something and somebody clicked that one click, which was a hug, they felt like actually like they were receiving some social support. So that was kind of surprise, like a pleasant surprise. Another thing that we did was we were rethinking attention algorithms. So if you see, so because this was intended to be a social support app from the beginning, if you see somebody post something that you feel they need more attention, we had a mechanism for doing that. So there was this bell feature that we had, where if you think that, you know, for example, if someone says, oh, I'm having like a really bad day and they feel terrible or whatever, and you feel like they need more attention, you can kind of ring the bell, and that pushes that post into a separate feed so that those posts get a little bit more attention. So it's kind of like using crowdsourcing to help people get more attention. And that way, you're also trying to get students to kind of interact with each other and try to identify people who actually need more attention. Another thing that we had was attention bots. So this was what I think was a really cool experiment. We had these bots that automatically hugged people when you posted something. So when you post something after we had like a random time frame, the bot would automatically hug you. And we did an experiment where we had a bot that kind of looked like that had a username like a woman, and then a bot that had a username like a man, and then a bot that said like, I am a bot. And if the bot seemed like it was a person, people felt very good about it. And over time, since this bot is consistently hugging them, they started to develop very positive emotions toward this bot. Of course, if they knew it was a bot, it had an adverse effect where they were like, why is this bot hugging me? And, and they did not like it at all. But then we identified that actually that creates more problems. Like if you're developing feelings for this bot, which is actually a bot, then, you know, you're kind of set up for disappointment. So what we did is we had a network of mentors on campus who have already been kind of through this training to help freshmen become juniors and so forth. And so what we did is we had the bot, but ultimately the bot was linked to an actual human being, so that if there were ever the chance that somebody really wants to reach out to the bot, actually there's a person at the end of the line. So of course the advisors, these kind of advisors slash mentors couldn't be monitoring the social media all the time. So the bots were doing their job in kind of making sure everyone's hugged. But at the end of the line, there was an actual human being. And that was something that we had not anticipated when we initially had done the design, but through the design and evaluation process, we realized we actually need a human being at the end of this. The last part is incorporating mood. So every day when you first log into the app, it asks you very simply, how is your mood? And if you're feeling really bad, we promoted your posts in a special feed so that those who were not feeling very well could perhaps get more attention. So the kind of lesson learned from the previous project was, like bots can really help, and they can help scale interactions, especially because one person cannot be monitoring social media all the time. But there needs to be a human touch at the end. And I'm kind of giving away the results already, because that's kind of what we found in the second project that I'm going to talk about, which is moderating in the context of live streaming. This is a relatively new project where we're looking at live streaming in moderation in the context of live streaming. And live streaming is an interesting context for moderation because if you post something on social media, you could choose not to look at the comments, right? But with live streaming, as you're streaming, people are posting comments in near real time. And as a streamer, part of the kind of affordances of this is that you interact with people who are talking to you. And so in this situation, it's really, if someone is posting something that's like very abusive, it's really hard to ignore. So how do you moderate something like this? And so there have been a lot of development of third-party tools going on. And platforms such as Twitch, they're coming up with their own moderation tools. So there's been a lot of focus on how do we make better algorithms to deal with this situation. And of course, there's proactive dealing of the situation, like for example, banning certain words from ever being typed. So for example, one thing that happens very often is like if you were to use like a very derogatory term and try to type it in, it wouldn't even appear in chat because the algorithm is banning it. However, you can develop all these algorithms, but the fact is that bots have limitations and people get creative. Like they could use alternative spellings. There are always ways that people can find their way around things. And then if the algorithm is too restrictive, then certain things cannot be said. So for example, we've done some interviews with streamers as well as moderators and found that certain terms are actually quite neutral, but are sometimes suppressed by algorithms. For example, like the word breast. If you have like your moderation settings on high, it bans the word breast. But then someone was talking about breast cancer and suddenly they were banned from chat because they had used that word. And so because of these kind of, I guess, exceptions to the rule, people are becoming increasingly hesitant to use a very strong algorithmic filter because then the filter inhibits people from expressing things that may not be deviant content. And so this was, we initially started this project focusing on the technology. We were like, how do we build better algorithms for moderation? And through these interviews and over 200 hours of observation, quickly learned that there's a limitation, there's like a limit to what the algorithm can do. And of course, it helps scale the moderation activities of those who are doing the moderation. But at the end of the day, there's a lot to be said about the humans that are working to make this environment a positive space. And so I'm kind of out of time, so I won't go too deep into this, but developing and facilitating positive community norms seems to be what at least the streamers are focusing on more, because they realize that you can ban people all you want, but banning people is different from creating a positive community. And creating a positive community isn't something that the algorithm is necessarily going to do, or at least algorithms in their current state are not doing. So conclusion is algorithms can play a prominent role, but at least from these kind of two different projects we found, they're never enough on their own. And the most effective way of using it was when there was some kind of human touch at the end, or they were playing an assistive role in making these kind of human interactions more scalable. And so kind of similar to what Jessica was saying earlier, as designers, can we really reconsider what attention means and looks like? Can we nudge certain pro-social behaviors through how we design things? And I would like to argue yes, because even for very, very small features, we see that, you know, those really kind of influence how people think about the space and the environment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you guys. So we have about 15 or 20 minutes for questions. So Vitak, if you want to come on up. Who has a question?
These podiums are way too high for short people.
No question.
Don't be shy.
With an Njit Buddy, how do you curate the kids? How is that curation? Or is it just chronological?
So we had we had a chronological one, and then we had the special feed, and the special feed was curated by the kind of their mood and as well as the crowdsourced attention button that we had.
Could you talk a little bit more about the attention button? Like, how do people react to having others say, like, this person needs attention? Do they feel like...
Yeah, so that kind of had like a mixed effect. Like, first of all, people didn't understand what that attention button was because it's not something that exists in other social media right now. So it took, we had to design a better kind of tutorial thing. Especially, we had a tutorial, but people kind of dismissed it right away and didn't pay attention to it. So that took surprisingly, that took a little bit of time. It was, I wouldn't say that it was the most successful feature, because then, like, some people started gaming the system where they would try to post something to try to get people to give them more attention. So yeah, it is similar to a like button, I guess, but
I think it's more like a bump, like when people comment bump to get something to go back up higher in the newsfeed is what I was thinking.
Yeah, so it's kind of like an upvoting function, but I think the important thing was separating that from the hub, which was the form of one-click feedback. So it was kind of like adding another mechanism to it.
So I know there's a lot of talk about issues of privacy in social media, and obviously people don't want important information or information they value to be stored, like credit card numbers, right? Don't be upset. But for the most part, a lot of other information people, like you mentioned, someone mentioned, really don't care. So is this big issue of privacy more of a concern of researchers, social activists, and typically typical citizen really doesn't care much about privacy the way that we think they do?
I mean, I think if we look at the way privacy is treated in Europe, we can see very clearly that there are cultural differences. So, like in the U.S., our take on privacy is exactly what you said. There's the way we define PII, personally identifiable information in the U.S. is things like your social security number, your credit card number. In Europe, in the EU, the way they define it extends far beyond that to include these kinds of like cultural interests, this idea of like your taste profile, like the other things that can identify you. And I think it's really hard for people to wrap their head around the idea that like my Google searches alone can identify me, but we've proven it again and again that your Netflix searches, all these things that by themselves can't. And to me, the really terrifying thing is when these companies start selling the data to each other. But again, this is all things happening under the hood, in the black box that people, one, don't have a lot of knowledge about, don't have like the desire to learn about, and companies themselves aren't in, they have no reason to try and shed more light on it.
So I think the idea of not knowing and not caring are related, but they're different, right? I mean, people just don't care.
Yeah, so, I would say the other way to frame differences between, and using the US and Europe is a common comparison, is this idea in the US, we take a very reactive approach to privacy. If you've ever had your identity stolen, you probably have taken steps beyond what you used to do. Like you reacted to having your privacy violated and you made changes. But a reactive stance toward privacy invasion is a horrible idea. It's like, well, let me wait until something bad happens to me and then I'll deal with it.
I'm not saying that, right? What I'm saying is that, like, when information is taken, other than credit card numbers, for example, people really don't care. For the most part, the general public, there's not a great outcry. It happens so many times, right? I see it all the time. And people just don't seem to care. Is that maybe an issue where people just don't care about it, no big deal?
I don't know that I agree with that, because look at how people are freaking out about this Cambridge Analytica
Or
stuff.
how they're not freaking out. I mean,
I don't think people, see, I'm one of those people who's in the crowd who's like, I've been telling you all this for the last 6 years, and none of you have all been listening to me, and then you're just giving away data. So for me, like, I don't think it's that big of a deal, but yeah, people are losing their, you know what, over this stuff. And because suddenly the curtains are pulled back and they're like, wait, what? When I added that app and I clicked the button and it said okay and I didn't read it as I, dismissed all those things and it was telling me they're going to get access to every piece of data that they were going to do something
People are
with
upset
it.
because Donald Trump got elected and they think this helped him get elected, right? That's why they're upset, right? But
That's not the only reason they're upset. It is just like with the social contagion study when people felt like their trust and their privacy and their data was somehow violated.
And then we went back to Facebook all over again and have the same conversation again.
Oh, I know.
So,
Okay, maybe we can open it up, since maybe you guys can talk offline. I'm gonna give other people a chance to ask questions.
Kind of along that same line, you said
Oh,
yeah. Different though. You said one of your research questions, I think, was looking at whether people understand what's happening to the data. Like, where do you get ground truth from that? Do you just, you said this is a black box. Fitbit is collecting data and selling it to other companies or collaborating with other companies to infer things. But how can we even say as researchers what's happening when we're comparing to what people feel is happening?
So in this study, we operationalized it in very specific ways. We asked them both open and closed-ended questions about does Fitbit require that you provide this information? Does Fitbit collect this information? And then, so that we had like required volunteer, I don't know, types of options that they could put. We put open-ended questions about like, do you know, does Fitbit sell your data? And then put, I don't know if you don't know. And if you said yes, like, who do you think they're selling data to? And then we literally were matching that up to what the privacy policies say. So we did it in, this very, very narrowly defined way of defining their knowledge of what happens with data.
Libby and then Eric?
Yeah, so I have a question about the idea of perfect data. So you mentioned that people often underestimate how accurate the data that a fitness tracker.
I would say they overestimate.
Oh, okay, right. That they think it's perfect, it's not. But we actually know that there is no such thing as perfect data.
Yeah.
But we have mechanisms for understanding the levels of uncertainty or a potential error in a lot of other data collection techniques. Are there similar measures for fitness tracker data that tell us like ranges or margins of error?
So I don't know if there's ever been scientific testing done on them. I have seen some testing to the extent of where they take all the ones that measure your heart rate and they're comparing them to actual medical devices, and then they do have ranges of like how accurate they are. So Fitbit, for example, is relatively accurate with your heart rate, is not at all with your sleep. So like trying to compare that to like doing the sleep study type thing, so you like really shouldn't put much credence in that. But of course Fitbit's not going to frame it when they sell it to you. Like it's going to track your sleep, just not super well. So
do we know if it tracks my sleep relative to my sleep, or is it the absolute measure of my sleep is bad?
That's a really good question. I don't know.
There was a study at Kai a few years ago that looked at where you put your Fitbit on and how accurate that was, because they actually measured the step. And actually having it on your arm is not very accurate. It's like you should have it on your waist. That's the most accurate place to.
Are these the like ensembles where like Matt Beats is running around with 12 different measures? But I guess I'm, like, from an archive perspective, when we're thinking about archiving data and what do people then want to know about it, these
Yeah.
measures of uncertainty would be useful if people do the project.
I don't know, I have been tracking my sleep for the last 2 years, and I don't even trust it as useful. The
Even about
data
yourself?
useful for myself alone.
Okay.
Yeah, even as like, if it was all bad data, like I still don't have, I still have very low, belief in the quality of it.
Thanks.
I want to talk about bots.
Oh,
No, it's great. I'm fascinated by bots. So my broad overview question is, what do you think the right way to design bots in social platforms is? Specific question is, I put this paper on my class syllabus that I'm totally fascinated by Kevin Munger. I don't know if you've seen this paper. It's called Experimentally Reducing Racist Harassment with Bots or Sock Puppets or something.
Oh, I
Sock puppets?
Yeah, so he used a variety of sock puppet accounts to reply to
On Twitter, is
racist
that the
tweets,
one?
and then
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
different
You and I
profile.
talked about it, you know where we stand.
Yeah. So like, I'm very curious about scaling up and computationalizing ideas like that. So like, what do you think the right way to do that is? So you had some interesting points in your talk about how, up front the bot should be about whether it's a bot. At what
Right.
point the bot should intervene. I think these are all really interesting and subtle design options.
I think the trickiest thing there is deception. If people know it's a bot, then, but for the bot to be effective, they should not know it's a bot. So I think it's, to some extent, there's like an ethical component of there is it okay for the bot to be deceptive about whether it's a bot? And that's something that I, of course, haven't figured out yet. But I think the other thing is that sometimes people there's like an increasing understanding of how bots work. And I think that if someone understands that that the bot is something that is not completely running on its own, but under the control of a human, then they have more openness to it. So I've seen this a little bit anecdotally in live streaming during our interviews. Is that in live streaming you can program certain bots to say certain things. They call like macros, like they have like fixed text that they've already done so that they can just like send it out. So the bot does that, but it's the person that creates those conversational scenarios. And so even though people know it's a bot, they're less offended because they know that it's not like a random thing, that it was actually designed to perform that very specific purpose. But I think that going back to the Twitter thing about if you created like these bots to mitigate racism, I think that raises again like the ethical issue of how much should we be meddling in trying to change people's behaviors, and kind of goes back to if we're kind of meddling to facilitate positive behavior, is that a good thing? So I think there needs to be more discussion around that, and maybe just also talking to people about how they feel about that.
Abraham, and then Liz.
Yeah, I had a question because it seemed both of you are emphasizing like in the design process, keep privacy in mind, keep like your things in mind. And I'm wondering to what extent do you feel like the importance should be placed on design, or a more like feedback sort of system, so that once problems arise to fix it? Because it seems like right now, privacy for design, we're focusing on today's privacy problems, but like tomorrow it could be a different one. So to what extent should we focus on designing systems in a certain way, and to what extent should we focus more on like, here's a system, and it might not be perfect, but we have this feedback system so that when problems arise, we fix it?
I definitely agree with you. It's like an iterative design is never something that you just design something once and then it's done. It's like it needs to be iterative. You need to get feedback from users, and I think that some companies have been very good about that, where maybe they made a mistake but then they tried to deal with it. What I was referring to more was that thinking about these things in the beginning when you're making it. It sounds like a very intuitive thing that you should do, but actually I've seen conversations on social media where engineers are like, well, why should we think about ethics? You know, why should we even care about that? I've seen people actually voice these things like,
Yeah.
we're an engineer, that's not our problem. And what I'm trying to argue that actually it is your problem. So,
Yeah, and if you do it from the get-go, then you're avoiding the bad press, you're avoiding the rush of having to try to figure out how to fix it when the problem does arise. I mean, obviously, yes, you always are going to have problems arise. My problem is when companies feel pressure, maybe they're publicly traded, maybe they have, you know, outside pressures on them to get new products out, and they push things out too fast, and they're just like, we'll push it out and then we'll see how it does, and we'll just address the problems as they come up, rather than taking a more thoughtful approach. And I realize there are competing interests there, and especially if you're publicly traded, like, money is the bottom line. But, you know, in an ideal world, these design conversations do happen more rigorously. They have ethicists and, you know, social scientists on design teams who are able to offer these other perspectives. And design teams are diverse, so you don't have algorithms that, like, then are categorizing, you know, black people as gorillas, like we saw with different sites. You know, these types of things where they could be avoided by changes that happen early on in the process.
I mean, one really good example of that is kind of a fiasco that happened a couple of years ago, where at the end of the year, Facebook was like showing you, oh, like your best moments of the year, or like celebrating, and one of the posts that came up in one man's feed was like a picture of his daughter who had died, and the algorithm pushed that photo to him because it had received a lot of feedback from other people. But they had presented it to saying like, oh, congratulations on this wonderful thing that happened to you last year. Because they thought, oh, you know, the person who designed that was, oh, if it gets a lot of feedback, it must mean it's good. But if you just think about, I guess it's more of a common sense thing, but it's not just all positive things that get a lot of feedback. Like sometimes negative things get feedback too. So if they had just paused to think about that, then instead of saying, oh, like look at, like celebrate this wonderful thing, it could have been something like, oh, like this really important thing happened to you, or, you know, and it's like a subtle wording, but like you could, you know, devastate some person because of something that you just didn't think about.
And they actually have changed the
They
thing
have
now
changed it,
to
yeah.
let you have things not get reminded of things. So like, you know, on this date type of things are in the collages.
So I know we're almost out of time. I just want to take the last two questions, Joy, Ojit, and Liz.
My question is, like, it might even be more of a suggestion than a question, going back to Eric's question about, like, this idea of how people are interacting with bots. Have you thought about do you call it a bot when you talk to, like, the people in your interviews about it?
So like in like debriefing, like we tell them it's a bot just so that we can see how they react to it. But in the field experiments, they don't know it's a bot. So our bots had kind of pseudonyms, so it was like a pseudonym system, and so they had like names like Cupcake Princess and College Dude. And
Yeah. Well, I just wonder if you call it something other than a bot, like not misrepresenting it, still kind of saying like this is run by an algorithm and this is what it's supposed to do, because right now culturally, like you say bot and you think Russian hackers. I mean, maybe not with younger college kids, but I just wonder if like part of what you could use to get around that would be like taking that loaded kind of word away from it.
Right, that's a good idea. But I've also seen on like in live streaming communities where bot has like a very neutral.
Yeah.
So I think it also depends on like the norms that develop on the particular platform.
All right, make it a good one.
Right, so actually very much dovetailing on my question where you said the norm is, what is the norm? I was wondering about like getting hugged by a stranger. Is this the norm?
It's
So
just
it
a
seems like
virtual hug though.
It's a virtual hug, but still, I mean, is there something that you think that this is a sign of the way maybe a certain group of people think
In
of?
the American Midwest, yes.
Yeah?
I mean, I think there's definitely.
Gender issues involved?
So we were concerned that perhaps, for example, if a woman was being hugged by a bot that was named kind of like a man, if they would feel uncomfortable. But surprising, so we're talking about like young college students, like they said that because it was virtual, they didn't feel like it was something, anything more than what it was. And also, it was the only option that was available for feedback, so they didn't really read into it anymore. But I'm sure if there's like other things plus a hug, then that might change things a little bit as well.
Great, okay, let's give our speakers a